The desert heat didn't care about contract dates or career goals, it just hung over the forward operating base like a wet wool blanket. For Sergeant Caleb Vance, the only thing that made the dust and the endless drone of diesel generators bearable was the rhythmic, familiar click of a wrench a few feet away. Maya was underneath the chassis of a heavily armored transport vehicle, her face smudged with grease and her dark hair pulled back into a tight, regulation knot. They had met 3 years prior during advanced training in the States, two bright-eyed recruits who shared a love for bad coffee and acoustic guitar riffs. Now, they were thousands of miles from home, navigating a deployment where every sunrise felt earned. "Hand me the half-inch socket, Vance," Maya muttered, her voice muffled by the steel underbelly of the truck. Caleb reached into the toolbox, his fingers finding the tool instantly. He handed it over, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. In the military, you learn to live in those micro-moments. They weren't supposed to be a couple, regulations had strict boundaries, and the reality of their environment demanded absolute professionalism, but everyone in their unit knew they were each other's anchor. When the alarms wailed or the horizon lit up with distant artillery, Caleb's first instinct was always to scan the perimeter for Maya's silhouette. That afternoon, the calm shattered. The radio in the command tent crackled to life with an urgent call for a recovery mission. A supply convoy had taken a hit along a notorious stretch of highway known as Route Viper, just 7 miles north of their position. The vehicle needed immediate mechanical recovery, and the perimeter required securing. "Vance, Rodriguez, Carter, gear up," the platoon sergeant barked. "Maya, you're on the wrecker. We need that asset back and inside the wire before sundown." Maya slid out from under the truck, her eyes immediately locking onto Caleb's. There was no fear in her expression, only the sharp, calculated focus of a soldier who knew exactly what was at stake. They grabbed their body armor, checked their rifles, and mounted up. The engines roared to life, kicking up a massive plume of tan dust as the small convoy rolled out through the heavily fortified gates and into the open, unpredictable expanse of the valley. The drive toward Route Viper was a tense exercise in hyper-vigilance. Caleb sat in the turret of the lead vehicle, his hand steady on the heavy machine gun, scanning the rocky ridges that flanked the highway. Every trash pile on the shoulder looked like an IED, every passing civilian vehicle felt like a potential threat. In the rearview mirror of the cabin below, he could see the massive frame of the recovery vehicle driven by Maya, keeping a tight, disciplined distance behind them. When they arrived at the scene, the air smelled heavily of burnt rubber and spilled fuel. The targeted supply truck was tilted on its side, one of its massive front wheels blown completely off by a roadside bomb. The crew of the damaged vehicle had already set up a defensive perimeter, looking shaken but uninjured. "Establish security. 360 degrees. Caleb yelled, dropping down from the turret to the asphalt. Maya was already moving. She hopped out of the cab of the wrecker, heavy steel chains draped over her shoulder like a dark tapestry. She didn't hesitate, immediately assessing the damage to the crippled transport. Caleb stationed himself near the front bumper of her vehicle, his rifle raised, covering the high ground to the east where the hills dipped into a shallow ravine. "How long, Maya?" he called out, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline. 10 minutes if the axle isn't snapped. 15 if I have to rig a bypass, she shouted back, already crawling near the mangled suspension. Her movements were fluid and efficient, a testament to hundreds of hours spent under pressure. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a motorbike engine from the hills. Caleb squinted through his optics. A kilometer away, 2 figures were observing them from a crest. A second later, the distinct, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of an automatic weapon echoed across the canyon, and the asphalt just 3 feet from Maya sprayed outward in a shower of sharp stone chips. "Sniper! East Ridge!" Caleb roared, immediately returning fire to suppress the position. "Get down!" Maya didn't panic. She dropped flat against the gravel, using the massive tires of the wrecker as cover, but her hands never let go of the winch cable. She knew that if they didn't hook this vehicle up right now, they would all be sitting ducks in a prolonged firefight. "Keep him busy," Caleb," she yelled, her voice cutting through the sharp cracks of returning rifle fire from the rest of the squad. With incredible coolness under fire, she dragged herself forward, looping the heavy steel hooks into the towing eyes of the broken truck, completely exposed to the open valley for a terrifying 5 seconds. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as he poured suppressive fire toward the ridge, the empty brass casings clinking sharply against the hot pavement. He could hear the heavy thud of Maya's wrench and the mechanical groan of the winch locking into place. Every second felt like a year. "Winch is secured. We're ready to haul," Maya shouted, her voice raw but steady. "Mount up. Move, move, move," Caleb yelled, signaling the rest of the squad to break contact. Maya scrambled back into the cab of the recovery vehicle, threw the transmission into reverse, and heavy diesel smoke poured from the exhaust as she pulled the crippled transport out of the ditch. The convoy began its chaotic retreat, bullets still snapping through the air around them, kicking up sparks where they struck the heavy armor plating. Caleb stayed in his turret the entire way back, his muscles locked tight, only relaxing when the massive steel gates of the forward operating base finally slammed shut behind them. That evening, the adrenaline crash hit hard. The base was quiet, save for the distant hum of the generators. Caleb found Maya sitting on a stack of wooden crates behind the maintenance depot, cleaning the grease and dust from her hands with a damp rag. Her shoulders were dropped, the fierce soldier exterior temporarily set aside. He walked over silently and sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them to respect the uniform, but close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. "You were terrifyingly good out there today," Caleb said softly, looking at her profile in the dim light of the base lamps. Maya let out a breath that was half sigh, half laugh. "I just wanted to get back here. With you." She stopped cleaning her hands and looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We only have 3 weeks left on this rotation, Caleb. 3 weeks until our active duty contract is up." "I know," Caleb murmured, reaching down to briefly press his hand over hers. For the first time in months, they weren't just thinking about the next mission or the next patrol. They were looking past the wire, past the desert, toward a life where they wouldn't have to worry about the horizon exploding. "We're going to make it home. Both of us." Those 3 weeks dragged on like a slow-bleeding battery, each day marked by routine patrols and an unspoken, anxious countdown. But the horizon stayed quiet, and the final flight manifest arrived without any last-minute extensions. The transition from the sun-baked concrete of the airfield in Kuwait to the cool, crisp air of the civilian terminal in Atlanta felt completely surreal. One day they were wearing 60 pounds of body armor, and the next, they were walking among crowds of people who had no idea what Route Viper even looked like. 6 months later, the desert was nothing more than a collection of framed photos on a mantelpiece and a pair of worn-out boots tucked away in the back of a closet. They had officially transitioned out of active duty, trading the rigid structure of the military for the beautiful uncertainty of civilian life. It was a Saturday morning in a quiet, green suburb of Nashville. The air smelled of fresh coffee and rain, a sharp contrast to the diesel smoke and dust that had filled their lungs for a year. Caleb stood on the back deck of their small, rented house, watching the fog roll off the nearby hills. He felt a sudden, familiar hand slide into his. Maya stood beside him, wearing an oversized flannel shirt instead of a flight suit, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked peaceful, the sharp, hyper-vigilant edge she had carried in the valley completely gone. Still checking the tree line, she teased softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Caleb smiled, squeezing her hand tightly. "Old habits." But no. Just enjoying the view. They had survived the worst the world could throw at them, anchored by a bond forged under fire. Now, they had the rest of their lives to build something quiet, safe, and entirely their own. Caleb looked down at her, seeing the same fierce, beautiful spirit that had saved them in the desert, and for the first time in years, he knew they were finally, completely out of the wire.